The Shroud of Turin is one of the most researched and studied relics in church history, and profoundly impacts many who encounter its mystery.
As a person of faith, looking at it through the eyes of faith, I don't think it can help but touch your heart.
Something that we can look on not only to bolster our faith in those moments of weakness, but also to deepen our faith and our appreciation, our intimacy with Christ.
Join Fiat Ministry Network and Patchwork Heart Ministry as they examine the science of the shroud through the lens of faith.
Really interesting scientific information that we didn't know about, like the pollen from all the different regions of the world. As the shroud traveled around, it picked that up. Some of the mites, things like that was really interesting to me. I mean, this made you really want to believe it a lot more.
It's impressive. Like, humanly, I don't think that is another level of love. It's not I'm gonna see people like, oh, I love you, I'll give you a chocolate. No. I'm giving you more than my life. I'm giving you my suffering.
Asking both experts and disciples, who do you say I am?
As far as who the man of the shroud is, I, as a person of faith and kind of reviewing the evidence there, it seems that a convincing argument can be made that it's Jesus of Nazareth.
Visit patchworkheart.org/shroud to learn more and get exclusive behind-the-scenes updates for your support.
The St. Raymond Nonnatus Foundation, in partnership with Patchwork Heart Ministry and Fiat Ministry Network, presents a podcast for families in crisis.
Hello, and welcome to a podcast from the St. Raymond Nonnatus Foundation for Freedom, Family, and Faith. This is Ann DeSantis, joined by our board president, Mickey Kelly. Mickey, welcome to our podcast again.
And so it's great to be here.
Thank you. Same to you. And we are at the beginning of our Families in Crisis Saint Series, 10 Saint Series. And last month we focused on our patron saint, which is St. Raymond Nonnatus. And of course, we are part of, and we were formed by, the Mercedarian Religious Order. So on this podcast number 2, we're going to talk about St. Peter Nolasco, our founder of the Mercedarian Order from the 13th century. And there's a lot to be found out about St. Peter Nolasco. I am actually referring to a couple different books that I have. One is called The Order of Mercy, the Mercedarians. It's a historical profile. And the other one is The Order of the Blessed Virgin Mary of Mercy, historical synthesis. It's a longer version of the same thing. And it goes from a historical synthesis from 1218, which is when the Mercedarian Order was founded. And this particular publication goes up into 1992. Now, I'm not going to unpack all of that on this podcast, but we do want to start out with the bio of our saint for the day. So our saint, again, is St. Peter Nolasco, and he was born at Mas de Santes Puelles near Castelnaudary, France in 1189, and he died at Barcelona on Christmas Day, 1252. He was of a noble family, and from his youth was noted for his piety, almsgiving, and charity. Having given all of his possessions to the poor, he took a vow of virginity to avoid communication with the Albigenses and went to Barcelona. At the time, the Moors were master of a great part of the Iberian Peninsula, and many Christians were detained there and cruelly persecuted on account of the faith. Peter ransomed many of these, and in doing so, consumed all of his patrimony. After mature deliberation, moved also by heavenly vision, he resolved to found a religious order in 1218, similar to that established a few years before by Saint John de Martha and Saint Felix de Blois, whose chief object would be the redemption of Christian slaves. In this, he encouraged by Saint Raymond Penafort and James I, King of Aragon, who it seems have been favored with the same inspiration. The institute was called, or is called, the Mercedarians, and was solemnly approved by Gregory the Ninth in 1230. Its members were bound by a special vow to employ all their substance for the redemption of captive Christians, and if necessary, to remain in captivity in their stead. At first, most of these religions were laymen, as was Peter himself, but Clement V decreed that the Master General of the order should always be a priest. His feast is celebrated on the 31st of January. And then it also says here in parentheses that with the reform of the general Roman calendar in 1969, the feast of St. Peter Nolasco on January 31st was suppressed. And he is commemorated in the Roman Martyrology and in local and particular liturgical calendars on the 28th of January. Now, I want to say again that there's a whole lot more about Peter Nolasco than I just read. But to start it out, I mean, it mentions that he was a layman. So isn't it amazing that God used him to start this beautiful religious order?
Oh, yes, and I definitely agree because I mean, especially when I recently came to know the Mercedarian friars, especially through the time that you and I have worked together. I have to be honest, I didn't really know much about St. Peter and Nolasco until I came on board. I came on board with the St. Raymond Nonnatus, let alone the fact too that I was confused for the longest time. I've actually confused the Mercedarians with Dominicans and the Norbertines because they wear like the same color habit and what have you. But I think what really sets them apart is that the Mercedarians, they wear the mercy shield, I like to call it, because I was taught by the Sisters of Mercy that were founded by Catherine Macaulay when I was in high school. And I think one of the amazing things that what makes the Mercedarians stand out, especially as we look at the 13th century, is that Spain at one point was that, of course, we're going back to the period of the Crusades. And at some point, you see that most of Spain was actually under the rule of the Muslims. And of course, you had a group that lived there called Moors. And of course, you had, the war between, the Catholics, Christian Spain versus, the Muslims, Moors, what have you. And some of the things that the Muslims were very known for was the slave trade. And if you think that slave trade, you think it's just something that happened, it was just made up out of a cloud or something that happened the last several centuries. That's not the case. There have been times, many powerful countries have resorted to slavery from time to time, and some of the time that there was like really ugly practice. And I think what we see here what is profound about the Mercedarians, that they were willing to do whatever it took to save someone from this walk-in prison, I like to call it, where people are being used for like their dignities being robbed and at times being abused. And these Mercedarians, they come in and they want to, do a radical thing. At the time was very radical, and that was, I'll take the place of such and such. And of course, the Mercedarians, like that did take the place that helped that person to become free, would come maybe like a pulp away from death. And we do see that with many of the Mercedarians, particularly St. Raymond Nonnatus, even St. Peter Nolasco, the top two that we are very well known, that we've come to know over the years.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. And admittedly, just like you said, before you met the Mercedarians, you didn't know much about, or maybe you knew nothing about St. Peter and Nolasco. And admittedly, I did not either. I am a third order member of the Mercedarian order, and there's an education that comes about when you decide you want to become a third order Mercedarians. And some people who are listening to this podcast, maybe you've heard of like a third order Dominican or a third order Carmelite or other religious order. So usually with most of those orders, they require you to learn about the history of it, but also prayerfully, give yourself to the charisms of the order. And so if anybody's listening to this podcast and is thinking, I think I would like to learn more about that, I would just say, please do reach out to us on the contact form at the St. Raymond Nonnatus Foundation at nonatus.org, and I can certainly connect you with the priest who's in charge of that. That would be actually the vicar of our order in the United States, Father Matthew Phelan, because you get the full education about all the different saints, and you learn about what it really means to be in that redemptive lifestyle, that we live our lives in the way that we also, as lay people, we give our lives prayerfully and sacrificially for those who are also in danger of losing their faith. And may I just add that that's the charism of this foundation, is that even though our patron is St. Raymond Nonnatus, obviously if it weren't for Peter Nolasco and for his actually starting the order through the Lord, through Our Lady of Mercy's intercession, and I should also mention that Our Lady of Mercy is a very important part of the whole charism, because it is called the Order of the Blessed Virgin Mary of Mercy. And so we're always interceding to the Blessed Mother, as did all of the Mercedarian saints, especially St. Peter Nolasco. And I just found something else from this book that I was reading about the life of St. Peter Nolasco, just a little bit of information. And this is from the Order of Mercy, the historical profile. It's actually a shorter book itself, but it says that after the Nolasco family had settled in Barcelona from a very early age, Peter learned the art of trading from his father, Bernardo. Father Sijar calls Peter that he gave himself, and confirms that Peter Nolasco was a merchant before he found the order. In fact, from the time he reached adulthood, his forthcoming charismatic mission in the church and society was already manifest in him. He would keep on being a merchant, except that he would not buy goods, but would instead dedicate his life to purchasing human beings. Peter associated with a few companions who shared his concerns for captives. And as Zomel stated, which is listed in this book, after persevering first in praying to God, they dedicated themselves daily to collecting alms from the pious faithful throughout the province of Catalonia and the kingdom of Aragon in order to carry out the holy work of redemption. This was done so that the saintly man and his companions would carry out quite a few deeds of liberation and redemption. All these things took place in the year 1203. So again, noting that he was a merchant. He wasn't already a priest or involved in any type of religious life per se, but God instilled in him when he says then he bought the captives, meaning that he actually ransomed these captives. And so the work that we do in the St. Raymond Nonnatus Foundation, there's all kinds of captivities today. And I know, Mickey, we can talk about that too. I mean, of course, there's something like human trafficking, which we can always pray for and, do as much as we can in terms of in the spiritual realm. There are organizations that actually help professionally, in a very professional manner, Catholic organizations to help to protect and to do the same kind of thing, to ransom them, right? But we, as this foundation, since we offer those spiritual works of mercy, is that we're also helping those other kinds of captivities, such as those affected by divorce, those who have gone through some kind of emotional or psychological traumas, those who have experienced health crisis or loss of a loved one, and types of addictions. Mickey, I didn't know if you wanted to share on that, because I really do believe that the work that we're doing really does line up with praying for those people and those families in crisis that are in captivities at times.
Yes, and I think some people may think that captivity, it's like, when we think of captivity, you just think it's about kidnapping, slave trade, trafficking, things like that. But I think it's like, but if you look at it, if you I kind of think of, you put that word and you kind of, I remember from our days in school where we had the thing where like you kind of draw these lines. It's kind of like you kind of create like a web of what that word could definitely mean if you go a little deeper. And for our families, I mean, oftentimes we have encountered, time and time again, someone that is stuck in, let's say, an abusive relationship, and maybe the marriage has fallen apart. Someone is trapped in an addiction, whether it be drugs, alcohol. And I think also, if you might want to plead the case too, maybe would say with social media, but how many people you think are doing what's called, like what sociologists or psychologists are calling what's called the doom scroll. So in other words, you're just taking out your phone spontaneously, just like scrolling through social media, like blah, 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 like hate, react, whatever the case is. But also too, I mean, like captivity is very deep, like, and of course our job really is to rescue people from these prisons that they're in.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. And I've been in this position now as director, actually executive director, coming on 5 years. And so, of course, I myself have communicated with quite a few people, families who are going through crisis and, as you just said, captivities. And what is captivity? Really, it's sin, isn't it? And what we do is through the teachings of the Catholic Church, leading people back to Christ, leading them to a life dedicated to God, leading them to the sacramental life, back to confession, back to Mass, as a family, prayer, rosary, dedication to the Blessed Mother as well. And of course, we have a host of saints too, not only saints within this religious order that we represent, but there's a host of other saints that are always praying for those people in crisis. In fact, may I mention that for this very podcast series, it's called 10 Saints, and it's our Families in Crisis series. So this is only podcast number 2, and we wanted to do the first 2 on our Mercedarian saints. But we're going to be talking about other saints that also are for those people who are in crisis. So next month, we'll be talking about John Paul the Great, St. John Paul II. So definitely tune in next month, and we'll be talking about him. That's a side note, but back to St. Peter Nolasco. And I'm reading here again from this book called The Order of the Blessed Virgin Mary of Mercy, the Historical Synthesis. And it's about the redemptive activity. It says that on the basis of his own experience, the experience of his companions, and with the enlightenment of the Holy Spirit, St. Peter Nolasco succeeded in creating an almost perfect method of liberating captives. His greatest achievement was to have known how to instill his followers the agents of redemption, the ideological and concrete principles which would subjectively prepare them to accomplish redemptive work successfully in such a way that Mercedarian brothers must, quote, always be gladly disposed to give up their lives if it is necessary, as Jesus Christ gave up his for us. The great novelty which Peter Nolasco introduced into the system was for him and his brothers to stay behind as hostages in Moorish lands to guarantee the amount of money that had been agreed upon for the ransom of the captives who had already returned to Christian lands and kingdoms as free people. Just think about all of those families over many years that were able to finally practice their faith because of the Mercedarian order. And think about 800 years, more than 800 years have passed, that this religious order is still living in that charism. I didn't know, Mickey, if you or I, and we can both share what our experience is with the Mercedarians that we know and how the ways that they live out giving their lives for those in danger of losing their faith. You and I have listened to Father Daniel Bowen, who knows so much about the order, and he's our vocation director for the order, which you can find out more at orderofmercy.org. But they certainly do continue to live out their lives for those who are truly in danger of falling off and not practicing their faith.
Oh, of course. And I feel like most of the Mercedarians that we have encountered, they seem like they are willing to step into the breach if, like, to help someone to become free, and then take on the tortures that like Jesus did when he took everything on, all of our sins, all of our transgressions. And this order too, they never they're very they are extraordinary. And I mean, I know they're not common in the United States as like Dominicans, Norbertines, Franciscans, Jesuits. I'm sorry I even mentioned them. But whatever the other orders that are very well known to us. Mercedarians, on the other hand, like, I honestly think that they are I honestly think they're like one of the most underrated orders in the church, especially if we haven't really come to know like the history of them, like how they came about and what have they done. And like many orders, they take the traditional chastity, obedience, poverty, but of course most of them add an additional vow that fits into their charism. And for example, we look at the Mercedarians, as we have been saying in this episode, that they were willing to do whatever it takes to free people that are held in captivity. And today, captivity cannot just be for sex trafficking or whatever other things that could be sins of the flesh, but also it could also be people who are trapped in occasions of sin, like sin of the flesh. And no question, some of the Mercedarians, they're especially Father Dan Bowen, and there's no question he's listening to us right now. Hi, Father Dan. He at one point, he was, I believe, was a Jehovah's Witness, he was telling me. And, eventually he became to the Catholic Church, and people would confuse him for the Klan. It would confuse him, like, are you really a priest? Or, whatever the the false idea people have in their heads about his habit. But bottom line, the Mercedarians, I mean, I've seen many Mercedarians, they continue to wear, the traditional habits wherever they go. And most of them, well, I'm sure all of them, they're not afraid to speak their minds or even defend the faith when the going gets rough.
Absolutely true. And you're right. I wouldn't be surprised if Father Daniel or some of the other Mercedarians are listening to this podcast, because this is a special one, especially for them. And thank you for, just some of those reflections that you had about the order, because it really is special. And as you said, maybe perhaps underrated, because I know that when I finally learned about them back in 2012, I can't believe it's already been 10 years for me, that I was blessed to find out about them. And I'll give all of you a little story about how I met them, because I think it's interesting to note that really God had me on a search, and that this is where the Holy Spirit brought me personally, and even to become a member of the Third Order, and finally the executive director of this foundation, the St. Raymond Nonnatus Foundation, is that back in the year of 2012, two of my spiritual directors had died in a year. I had a father, a priest of the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, that was an older priest. He died of cancer. And then a sister, she was actually a sister of mercy, that was my spiritual director for a little while too. She got cancer and also died. So it's kind of a rough time of my own life. My younger daughter at the time was just getting over a really difficult time in her own life. And I was kind of, quite honestly, I think my captivity during that time period was a depression and an anxiety, just about things that were going on at home and being able to help my daughter, but also feeling like a little bit weak in my faith because I was going through somewhat of a trauma at home. And so I had a Catholic directory. It was something that's available through the Archdiocese of Philadelphia that had like a list of all the different parishes and ministries. And I purchased it because I thought it's always nice to be able to see where these parishes are located and the different nonprofits and groups and organizations within our archdiocese. And so I kind of was like hunting through this book, and I came upon a list of what they listed, I think, as monasteries. And I thought, oh, monasteries, I could always ask for prayer or see if there's a spiritual director there. And lo and behold, when I made that phone call was when Father Daniel Bowen, who wasn't a priest at the time yet, he was in formation. In fact, he wasn't even a deacon yet, preparing for priesthood. They referred to him as Brother Daniel. And I pretty much told him my story. And he, at the time, said he wasn't a priest, but that he referred me to a priest that would be my spiritual director. And that would be Father Matthew Phelan, who was my spiritual director for quite a while, introduced me to the Third Order. And not only did I become a member, but my husband also became a full-fledged Third Order back in 2019. It was before the pandemic that my husband became Third Order. So it's just been a wonderful blessing that we have learned about the order, prayed the way that Mercedarians do, and just trying to give our lives as a family for those in danger of losing their faith. And it really is a charism, I believe, to be able to do that. I wanted to read something, if I could, Mickey, too, that this is from the Order of Mercy website, which is the Mercedarians' own website. On the About Us page is to mention that the order exists today in 17 countries, including Spain, Italy, Brazil, India, and the United States. In the US, its student house is in Philadelphia, and it also has houses in New York, Florida, and Ohio. I may mention that the student house is transferring to Columbus, Ohio in pretty soon, so keep an eye out there. It also says that today, friars of the Order of Mercy continue to rescue others from modern types of captivity, such as social, political, and psychological forms. They work in jails, marginal neighborhoods, among addicts, and in hospitals. In the United States, the Order of Mercy gives special emphasis to educational and parish work. The spiritual and communal life of the friars include prayer, meditation, Holy Mass, recreation, and apostolate. Their life is based on the rule of St. Augustine, which some religious orders are based on the rule of St. Augustine, and the constitutions of the order. Overall, the Order of Mercy commits itself to give testimony to the same good news of love and redemption that it has shown since the beginning of its history. And for more information, again, I'll just mention, go to the orderofmercy.org. So I didn't know, Mickey, if you had any final words, because we're coming to the end of the podcast, but I definitely want to call to action to those listening to not only connect with us, but to connect with the Mercedarian Order.
Well, and honestly, I think people are listening to this podcast be like, wow, I didn't even heard of this person, like, just like us. And let's face it, the Mercedarians, they are very rich in history, considering the fact too that, well, they're also in quite a bit of like that crowded time in the early 13th century where you had the Franciscans, Dominicans, and Norbertines. Like, you hear about those three that were founded in the early 13th century, yet I think we kind of overlook the Mercedarians. And it's just remarkable that, like, just like the other orders, the Mercedarians, they have their saints, and so it's unfortunate that they kept, some of the saints kept getting bounced around a little bit when it comes to their feast days, and hopefully they're going to stay where they are. I'm hoping and praying. As far as the final words is, like many saints, if you want to know who they are, first and foremost, see if you can find a biography of them. 2, learn about the saints and how can you apply some of the deeds that they have done to promote God's kingdom on earth now. And always remember that the Mercedarians are here for you, as well as our foundation, St. Raymond Nonnatus. Don't be afraid to reach out to us, and we'll help free you from any captivities that you are in.
Thank you, Mickey. Yes, any captivities that you're in, because that's who we are, and that's who the Mercedarians are. And Mickey, I just want to say to you, thank you for your leadership as board president, someone who, just like me, we both are learning together more and more about the Mercedarian order and being able to spread the word together about the charisms. And I also want to make it a point to thank all of our Mercedarian priests and brothers for their sacrifice, for their offering up prayers for so many people and families, and also those daily masses and masses that are going on all the time, Sunday masses, and just all of their love, prayers, and continual work for the redemption of souls. And that's who we are. Also, as I say on every podcast, be sure to make your free pastoral consultation with a Mercedarian friar by reaching out to us at nonatus.org on the priestly consultation page right there. Thank you, everyone, for listening to this podcast. Mickey, again, thank you.
Thank you, Anne, for having me.
God bless everyone. We'll see you next month here for the Families in Crisis podcast for the St. Raymond Nonnatus Foundation for Freedom, Family, and Faith.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. For more information about the St. Raymond Nonnatus Foundation, visit nonatus.org or email director.srnf@gmail.com. Today, many students go to college with numerous questions about their faith, yearning to know if the seed planted in them as a child is both true and practical. Using the miracle on the road to Emmaus as a model, young adult ministers conversed weekly for 3 months with college students about the most pressing questions they had about the Catholic faith. As they journeyed together virtually, something amazing happened. Doubts disappeared, fears faded, and Jesus revealed that He is still alive. Hearts Burning Within Us, the latest book from Patchwork Heart Ministry, is a result of that grace-infused conversation. It is the perfect back-to-school gift for recent high school graduates and current college students. Get your copy for them today at patchworkheart.org or by calling 424-704-3278. That's 424-704-3278.